Now, as we get started in the course, I want to take just a real quick time out here and talk about just a little of the basics of the history of C++. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why do I need to know anything about the history of C++? Well, it will help you to understand some things that you're going to bump into later on. So we'll do this quickly here. I know history is not most people's favorite subject. Now, in the early 1960s, that's your first clue about why C++ is so powerful and why it is so prevalent out there. It dates all the way back to the absolute birth of what we now know as the personal computer and the local area network and all those other things and the servers and everything. So it'll go all the way back to the early 1960s, and what was happening was as these new ideas and new giant functioning pieces of equipment called computers were coming online, there were a lot of new programming languages that were appearing for these early computers, and around about 1963, CPL appeared. Now, this was the Combined Programming Language, and notice the word combined there. This was a big language. It was difficult to learn and implement. It was some of the early first passes, some of the early first ideas at how languages should be constructed and implemented, and it just really didn't quite do the trick for what we would need later on. Later in the 1960s, somewhere around 1967, a fellow named Martin Richards developed something called BCPL. This is the Basic Combined Programming Language, and what Martin did is simplified CPL and made it a little better, but it was still a fairly large, unwieldy, not horribly efficient language. But the evolution was on, and the technicians were learning more and more. And then in the early 1970s, a gentleman named Ken Thompson, who, by the way, worked on the development of Unix, you've probably heard that term before, at Bell Labs, also created what was called the B language. Now, there was no A language, but we do have a B language here. And this was another simplification of BCPL. Now, keep in mind that as of yet, we didn't really have a language that was going to solve all the problems or take us where we needed to go, but we were on the way there. But the big strength here, notice, these languages were based on the prior languages. And so what you're getting here is what we would call, if we were talking about a family tracing ancestry, you're getting a lot of good roots. And you're getting a lot of good stability being passed down. Now, the interesting thing about the B language is it did not compile down to executable code. It actually only compiled down to threaded code, which meant that it didn't run very efficiently, but we were, again, on the way, progressing down the road. Then also in the 70s, a guy named Dennis Ritchie, who, by the way, also was with Bell Labs, worked with a B compiler that did produce executable code. Now, this is where we saw our first look at the C language, because his B compiler that produced executable code came to be known as the C language, and this, by the way, also introduced the idea of data types to the language. So when you use integer data types or character or char data types nowadays, you can thank Dennis Ritchie, going all the way back to the early 70s, because this is where we first saw those. Now, in 1980, I'll try to pronounce this, Bjarne Stroustrup, okay, or Strustrup is the way he pronounces it, I believe, but keep in mind, what you just heard is the Middle Tennessee pronunciation of this name, and no doubt I butchered it, so I'm sorry for that. But anyway, Bjarne was also at Bell Labs, and he began development in 1980 of a language called C++. And again, what he was trying to do is find the strengths of the previous languages, build on those, build in the things that they needed for what they knew about computer technology and computer science at the time. And as a result, we saw our first commercial release of C++ in October of 1985. Now, folks, it's 2011. And as you well know, in computer years, 2 or 3 years is almost an eternity. This thing dates all the way back to 1985, and we can even trace its roots back a lot farther than that. Now, what's next for C++? Let me give you a real quick teaser here. There is a new version of C++ that's going to come along. As a matter of fact, it could be out anytime in 2011, and it's going to be called C++0hex. Okay? Z++0x, you'll hear it called hex, but C++0x is really the way to say it. And this is the newest standard for C++. It's not a replacement. It is C++ with a few enhancements. Now the final spec is supposed to be released sometime in 2011. By the time you get this course, it may have already been released, but it's going to take a little bit of lag time for it to become adopted. But you do need to, if you're watching this course, probably when you finish the section of movies that you're watching, jump out on Google, do some searches on C++0x, and just see what you can see out there about it and kind of start to read up on where we're headed next with C++. That's the history, and I'll refer back to this a little bit as we go through the course here, but it always helps you to know where this stuff came from.